Welcome to The Debate. Today, we are dissecting a concept that is, well, it's simultaneously the holy grail of the business world and an absolute minefield in academia. Leadership.
It is the ultimate buzzword, isn't it? I mean, it's an industry worth billions in books and seminars and coaching. Yet if you ask 5 experts to define it, you'll probably get 6 different answers. It's slippery.
It is slippery, but it's also fundamental. And that ambiguity brings us right to the central tension we're unpacking today. The question isn't just, what is good leadership? The question is, where does it come from? Is leadership a coherent set of, innate traits, the great man theory, where specific individuals are genetically or psychologically wired to lead?
Or is that just a romantic myth? Is leadership actually a social process defined entirely by the situation, by the followers, and by the environment? In other words, does the person make the times, or do the times make the person?
I'm going to take the position that the person matters, fundamentally. I'll be arguing for the trait and attribute perspective. My stance is that leadership is rooted in stable individual characteristics. History is shaped by people who possess a specific constellation of traits, intelligence, charisma, grit, that allow them to step forward when others step back.
And I'll be taking the situational and constructivist side. I'm going to argue that what we call leadership is often a projection. It's a fluid process that is entirely dependent on context. I believe that the leader is a story we tell ourselves to make sense of complex dynamics, and that the environment is what actually dictates who rises, not some innate virtue.
Then let's get into it. And I want to start with history, because for centuries, this wasn't even a debate. If you look at Thomas Carlyle's work from 1841, Heroes and Hero Worship, the logic was crystal clear. Carlyle argued that the history of the world is essentially the biography of great men.
Which is a very 19th century romantic way of looking at things. It feels a bit like reading a mythological text rather than, science.
It is poetic, certainly, but it's also observational. Carlyle identified that certain individuals possessed specific talents, physical characteristics, and skills that allowed them to bend the arc of history. He wasn't just talking about kings, he was talking about prophets and poets and commanders. And while the language of divine right has faded, the data supporting the individual has actually gotten stronger in the modern era.
Has it? Because I recall trait theory taking a massive beating in the mid-20th century. Academics essentially threw it in the trash bin.
They did for a while, but it made a massive comeback. In the 1980s, modern meta-analyses re-established it with empirical rigor. We aren't talking about divine sparks anymore. We're talking about the big 5 personality factors. We now have statistical evidence that traits like extroversion, conscientiousness, and openness to experience are reliable predictors of leadership emergence.
Emergence being the key word there. Getting the job, not necessarily doing it well.
Well, we'll get to effectiveness, but you can't ignore the pattern. When you look at a Steve Jobs, you see a measurable level of determination and adaptability that exceeds the norm. When you look at Mother Teresa, you see high integrity and diplomacy. This is the leader attribute pattern approach. It's not just one trait, it's an integrated totality. Some people are simply built with the hardware to process social complexity and drive outcomes. It's a constellation of attributes that you can't just manufacture out of thin air.
See, I hear that, and I hear a desire to simplify the world. You're quoting Carlyle, but I'd point you to Herbert Spencer or even Karl Marx. Their counter-argument was that the times produced the person, not the other way around. If Steve Jobs had been born in an agrarian society in the 1600s, he wouldn't be a tech visionary, he'd probably just be a difficult farmer who argued about how to stack hay.
But he would still be the one leading the other farmers. The context changes, the drive doesn't. That drive is internal.
I disagree. In the late 1940s, Stogdell and Mann conducted massive reviews of the literature, and they found something that contradicts your innate hardware theory. They found that people who are leaders in one situation are not necessarily leaders in others. You take a brilliant military general, someone decisive, authoritarian, tactical, and you drop them into a creative design agency where the goal is abstract thinking and collaboration, and they often flail. If leadership were a stable trait like height or eye color, it should transfer anywhere. It often doesn't.
I'd argue that's a skills gap, or perhaps a domain knowledge gap, not a lack of leadership potential.
I think it's deeper than that. I think we suffer from what Mindel calls the romance of leadership. As humans, we're terrified of randomness. We hate the idea that organizational success is often luck or market forces or timing. So to make the world feel manageable, we attribute massive control to the person at the top. We invent the great man because the alternative, that chaos rules and nobody is really driving the bus, is just too scary.
That's a cynical take. You don't think individual competence drives results? You think it's all just people projecting their hopes onto a figurehead?
I think we confuse competence with visibility. Have you heard of the Babel hypothesis?
I have, but refresh our listeners. It's one of those studies that makes you question everything.
It's a fascinating, albeit depressing, finding in social psychology. Studies show that leader emergence, who gets picked to lead a group, is highly correlated with the sheer quantity of speaking time, not the quality, not the intelligence, just the amount of words spoken. If you talk a lot, people perceive you as leader-like. That doesn't sound like innate virtue to me. That sounds like we promote whoever likes the sound of their own voice.
That might explain some bad mental management, I'll grant you that. But you're ignoring the biological imperative. You can't talk about leadership without talking about evolution. It's not just about who talks the most. It's about survival.
Go on.
Van Vogt and Ahuja define this clearly. Humans are social species, just like ants, bees, or chimpanzees. We naturally select leaders because it solves coordination problems. We need a focal point to survive threats.
But we aren't ants. Ants are genetically programmed drones. Humans have agency. We can choose not to follow.
We are primates, though. Wrangham and Peterson wrote a book called Demonic Males that links human leadership directly to chimpanzee behavior. It's ugly, but it's real. It's about violence, territoriality, and competition for the chief male spot. There is a biological drive for hierarchy. We are hardwired to look for the alpha who can protect the tribe. That's not a social construct, that's DNA. When the group is threatened, we look for the strongest protector.
Okay, but you're cherry-picking your primates to fit a specific narrative.
How so?
You're focusing on chimps because they fit the dominance and violence model. But look at the bonobo. They're our second closest genetic relatives, sharing almost the same amount of DNA with us as chimps do. Bonobo society is matriarchal, it's peaceful, and they unite behind an alpha female who leads through coalition building, not through violence.
It's a valid counterexample, but chimps are generally considered the closer proxy for historical human aggression and warfare.
But it proves that biology isn't destiny, that dominance equals leadership model isn't the only biological path. And speaking of biology, look at the hormones. You mentioned the alpha. Van Vogt found that while testosterone correlates with dominance, it does not correlate with effective leadership.
Is there a functional difference in a crisis? Sometimes you need dominance to get things moving.
There is a massive difference. Dominance is forcing people to do things through fear or coercion. Leadership is influencing them to want to do things. If biology were the sole driver, the highest testosterone individual would always be the best leader. The data says they are usually just the most aggressive person in the room. Those are two very different things.
Fair point. I'll pivot then. Let's move away from the brute force biology and look at the psychology of perception. Because you're right, it's not just about muscles, it's about the mind. This leads to implicit leadership theories.
These are the prototypes we carry in our heads?
Exactly. We all have a cognitive template of what a leader looks like. Intelligence, trustworthiness, assertiveness. When an individual displays these traits, specifically authenticity, they are granted influence by the group. It's not just babble, it's emotional intelligence.
Which is a trait.
Ideally, yes. Leaders manage moods. They transmit positive affect through what's called emotional contagion. If a leader is optimistic and resilient, the group performs better because that energy is psychologically contagious. You cannot fake that over the long term. You have to have that emotional capacity. A depressed or erratic leader crashes the group's performance, purely through that psychological transmission.
I'm going to challenge the idea that you can't fake it. Have you looked at neo-emergent theory?
Lay it on me.
Neo-emergent theory suggests that leadership is often an impression formed by information management. Essentially, it's PR. It's not about what you are, it's about what you project.
You think it's all smoke and mirrors?
Let's look at a classic great man. Lord Nelson, British naval hero, won the Battle of Trafalgar, Historians know that Nelson was obsessed with his image. He would often write his own versions of battles and send them back to England before he even arrived, just to ensure the newspapers printed the story he wanted told.
That's savvy marketing, but he still had to win the battle first. He still had to command the fleet.
True, but the heroism was a construct he actively built, and this obsession with emergence, with who looks and sounds like a leader, is dangerous. It creates what researchers call absentee leaders.
I've heard this term. These are the empty suits?
Exactly. These are people who have the traits to get promoted. Maybe they are extroverted, tall, and confident. But once they're in the role, they psychologically check out. And here's the kicker. Research shows absentee leaders are actually worse for an organization than toxic leaders.
Worse than toxic? That seems like a stretch. A toxic boss ruins your life.
A toxic boss ruins your life, but you identify the problem immediately. You can bond with your coworkers against them. With an absentee leader, someone who emerged based on traits but doesn't engage, the incompetence is silent. It destroys role clarity and creates ambiguity. It proves that having the traits to get the job tells us nothing about your ability to actually do the work.
I think that's a failure of selection, not a failure of trait theory. But let's look at that work. You claim it's all situational. But I would argue that specific behaviors yield results regardless of the situation. There are universal tools that work.
Such as
Reinforcement theory. This is behavioral science 101, B.F. Skinner stuff. Empirical research covering the last 20 years suggests that leaders who effectively use positive reinforcement can boost performance by 17%. That is a measurable, universal outcome. It doesn't matter if you're running a coffee shop or a Fortune 500 company. If you reward good behavior, you get more of it. That is a skill the leader possesses.
Incentives work, I grant you that. But that's management, not necessarily leadership.
Then let's talk about transformational leadership. This is the gold standard, pioneered by Bayes and Riggio. We're talking about leaders who provide vision, intellectual stimulation, and individualized consideration. They don't just manage transactions, they move followers beyond self-interest. You cannot tell me that a leader who inspires a team to achieve the impossible is just a product of the situation. They are the catalyst for the situation.
I'm not denying that inspiration happens. I'm denying that one style works everywhere. I would counter with the Feeler contingency model.
This is the idea of fit over virtue.
Precisely. Fiedler argued that there is no ideal leader. It depends entirely on the favorability of the situation. If you are in a burning building, an extreme, unfavorable situation, you don't want a transformational leader asking you about your feelings or trying to intellectually stimulate you. You want a task-oriented authoritarian to scream, "Exit left, now!"
Agreed. In a crisis, command and control works.
But if you use that same authoritarian style in a creative marketing meeting, an intermediate situation, you destroy morale. You need a relationship-oriented leader. The person is just a variable. They only work if the equation around them is right.
So you view the leader as a puzzle piece.
Yes. And leader-member exchange theory, or LMX, takes it even further. LMX proves that leadership isn't a broadcast from a great man to the masses. It's a series of specific one-on-one relationships.
The dyad.
Right. Leaders naturally create in-groups, the people they trust, the teacher's pets, and out-groups, the people they manage by formal authority. If you are in the in-group, that leader looks amazing to you. If you're in the out-group, that same leader looks incompetent. So who is the real leader? It depends entirely on who you ask. It's a social transaction, not a personal characteristic.
But even in LMX, the leader is the one initiating that structure. The leader decides who is in the in-group. That implies agency. The leader is still the architect of those relationships.
Or the follower grants the legitimacy. Which brings me to the ultimate variable you were underestimating, culture.
I don't ignore culture, but I believe leadership traits transcend. Competence is competence.
I strongly disagree. The very concept of what a leader is culturally bound. In Confucian societies, the ideal is the scholar leader, based on filial piety and benevolence. In other cultures, it's paternalistic. A father figure who literally controls the personal lives of the workers.
Those are just different flavors of the same dish. They're still figures of authority and direction.
They are fundamentally different dishes. Look at gender perception. There was a fascinating study where they asked women to envision a leader. German women almost exclusively imagined a male executive. Indian women, however, were much more likely to imagine both men and women.
That speaks to societal bias, not the essence of what leadership is.
It speaks to the fact that the trait of leadership is actually just a reflection of the follower's bias. If you don't fit the follower's cultural mold, you cannot lead them. If you walk into a culture that values humility with your extroversion and charisma traits you say are universal, you might be seen as rude and arrogant. The power lies with the follower's perception, not the leader's personality.
I see the logic, but I have to push back on the idea that it's all relative. There is significant research into global leadership competencies. In a globalized economy, things like cognitive complexity and global business savvy are required whether you are in Berlin, Bangalore, or Boston. The problems are universal, so the skills to solve them must be too.
Required, perhaps. But are they sufficient?
I would argue they are essential. And consider the alternative. You talk about situational leadership as if the group can just handle itself. But look at laissez-faire leadership, the hands-off approach. Research consistently shows that in leaderless groups, performance suffers, satisfaction suffers.
Because people hate ambiguity.
Exactly. Most people prefer to be led. They need direction to reduce uncertainty. If the situation were all that mattered, groups would self-organize perfectly every time. They don't. They wait. They wait for a leader to step up.
Or they wait for someone to take the blame.
No, they wait for vision. They wait for someone with the grit and the intelligence to cut through the noise.
Or they wait for the person who talks the most, the Babel effect, to tell them what to do.
We are circling back to the start, which suggests we're reaching the limits of the debate. But I think we've highlighted the complexity here. It's not a simple black and white issue.
We have. And here's my closing thought. We have spent centuries looking for the great man, and I think it is a dangerous pursuit. It ignores the role of luck, it ignores the Babel effect, and it ignores the overwhelming power of the situation. When we romanticize leadership, we give individuals credit for outcomes they didn't control. A leader is often just a surfer riding a wave they didn't create.
And I will maintain that while the wave matters, some people drown and others surf. You cannot ignore that individual differences, intelligence, emotional stability, drive, consistently predict who stays on the board. Leadership is, as Earhart and Jensen described it, an exercise in language that creates a future that wouldn't have happened otherwise. It is an act of individual will.
Perhaps the middle ground lies in the modern integrated psychological theory.
The move toward personal leadership.
Exactly. The idea is that before you can manage a situation or lead the followers, you must understand your own psychology. You have to know your traits to adapt to the context.
I can agree with that. Whether born or made, the effective leader is one who is conscious of both their own wiring and the environment they are operating in.
Indeed. So, to our listeners, we leave you with this question. Are you following a person because of who they are, or are you just responding to the situation you find yourself in?
Something to think about next time you're in a meeting. Thanks for listening to The Debate.